Imagine this, a teenage prince, barely 17, leading an army for the first time. A desperate queen, fighting to reclaim her husband's throne and secure her son's inheritance. And a charismatic, ruthless king, determined to crush his enemies once and for all. This isn't a fantasy novel. This is the brutal, bloody reality of the Wars of the Roses. Today, we're journeying back to 1471, to a fateful day in a meadow in Gloucestershire, where the final, tragic act of the House of Lancaster played out at the Battle of Tewkesbury. This is the story of how a dynasty, forged in rebellion and steeped in glory, met its end. To truly understand the stakes at Tewkesbury, we need to rewind the clock a little. The Wars of the Roses had been raging for 16 long years. This was a brutal family feud between two branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white rose. The crown had changed hands multiple times, and England was weary of the constant conflict. Our story's main players are on the Lancastrian side. King Henry VI, a gentle but mentally fragile man, often a pawn in his own court. His wife, the formidable Margaret of Anjou, a French princess who was the true power behind the throne, fiercely protective of her husband and her son. And that son, Edward of Westminster, the Prince of Wales, a young man raised in exile, carrying the hopes of his entire house on his shoulders. On the Yorkist side stood King Edward IV. He was everything Henry VI was not: tall, handsome, a brilliant military commander, and utterly ruthless. He had seized the throne in 1461, but the Lancastrians, particularly Margaret, refused to give up. After a decade of fighting, Edward IV seemed secure, but then, a spanner in the works. His most powerful ally, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, switched sides. Warwick, feeling slighted by Edward, aligned with his old enemy Margaret of Anjou. Together, they invaded England and, in a shocking turn of events, put Henry VI back on the throne in 1470. Edward IV was forced to flee to Burgundy. But you can't keep a good Yorkist king down. Less than a year later, in the spring of 1471, he was back. He landed in England with a small but determined force, gathering support as he marched south. His comeback was swift and brutal. On April 14th, at the Battle of Barnet, just outside London, Edward IV faced the Kingmaker. In a confusing, foggy battle, Warwick was killed, and the Yorkists won a decisive victory. Edward IV was king once more. Just as this news was spreading across England, Margaret of Anjou and Prince Edward finally landed at Weymouth in Dorset. They had been delayed by storms for weeks. Had they arrived earlier, they could have joined forces with Warwick, and history might have been very different. Now, they were alone. The news of Warwick's defeat and death at Barnet was a devastating blow. Margaret was apparently so distraught, she considered returning to France. But the Lancastrian nobles, who were with her, like the Duke of Somerset, persuaded her to fight on. They believed they could still rally support in their traditional heartlands in Wales and the north. Their plan was to march north, cross the River Severn, and link up with Welsh forces loyal to their cause. This set the stage for a desperate race across the English countryside. The Lancastrian army, led by the Duke of Somerset and the young Prince Edward, marched at a grueling pace. They were exhausted, demoralized, but driven by the hope of reinforcement. Hot on their heels was Edward IV. He knew he couldn't let them reach Wales. He had to force a battle and destroy them before they could regroup. Edward marched his army relentlessly, covering incredible distances. The Lancastrians aimed to cross the Severn at the city of Gloucester. But the governor of Gloucester, a Yorkist loyalist, refused them entry and barred the bridge. This was a critical setback. It forced the Lancastrians to march further north, to the next available crossing at Tewkesbury. They were losing precious time. On May 3, 1471, the exhausted Lancastrian army finally reached Tewkesbury. They had marched 24 miles in a single day, a punishing feat for men in armor. They were too tired to cross the river that night. Instead, they decided to make a stand. They chose a strong defensive position just south of the town, with Tewkesbury Abbey at their back. Their flanks were protected by rivers and streams. They believed they had the advantage of the high ground and could force the Yorkists to attack them uphill. It seemed like a solid plan. The next morning, Saturday, May 4th, the sun rose on two armies ready for battle. The Lancastrian army, about 6,000 strong, was divided into three sections or battles. The right was commanded by the Duke of Somerset. The center, where the 17-year-old Prince Edward stood, was nominally under his command, but likely guided by experienced veterans. The left was commanded by the Earl of Devon. Facing them was Edward IV's army, slightly smaller, but composed of battle-hardened veterans, fresh from their victory at Barnet. Edward also divided his forces into three. He himself commanded the main body. His younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future King Richard III, commanded the left wing. Lord Hastings commanded the right. Crucially, Edward noticed a small, wooded hill on the Lancastrian right flank. He detached 100 spearmen and ordered them to hide in the woods, ready to attack the Lancastrian flank and rear if the opportunity arose. This small, seemingly minor decision would prove to be absolutely decisive. The battle began with the typical medieval exchange of archery and cannon fire. The Yorkist artillery, in particular, was very effective, pouring fire into the densely packed Lancastrian ranks. The Duke of Somerset, commanding the Lancastrian right, grew impatient. He couldn't just stand there and watch his men get cut down. In a bold, perhaps reckless move, he decided to attack. Somerset led his men down from the high ground and swung around to attack Edward IV's left flank, commanded by the young Duke of Gloucester. It was a classic flanking maneuver, and for a moment, it seemed to be working. Gloucester's men were pushed back, and in some disarray. This was the critical moment of the battle. If the Lancastrian center under Prince Edward had advanced to support Somerset's attack, they might have broken the Yorkist line, but they didn't. For whatever reason, perhaps indecision, perhaps fear, perhaps a breakdown in communication, the Lancastrian center held its position. Somerset and his men were left isolated, fighting alone. And then, Edward IV's hidden card came into play. The 200 spearmen he had hidden in the woods charged out, crashing into Somerset's flank and rear. Attacked from the front, the side, and now the back, Somerset's division completely collapsed. Panic spread through the Lancastrian army like wildfire. Seeing Somerset's men routed, the rest of the army broke and fled. It became a slaughter. The fleeing Lancastrians were cut down in a field still known today as the Bloody Meadow. Many tried to escape across the River Severn, but were drowned by the weight of their own armor. What happened to the Lancastrian leaders was a grim tale. The Duke of Somerset and other nobles sought sanctuary in Tewkesbury Abbey. In theory, this meant they were safe from violence, but Edward IV was in no mood for mercy. 2 days later, he had them dragged out of the abbey, given a quick sham trial, and publicly executed in the town square. And what of the prince, the hope of Lancaster, 17-year-old Edward of Westminster? Accounts of his death vary. Some say he was killed in the fighting, others that he was captured and executed immediately after the battle, possibly in the presence of King Edward IV himself. Whatever the exact circumstances, his death was the nail in the coffin for the Lancastrian cause. With him gone, there was no direct male heir. The line had ended. The final, tragic postscript came a few weeks later. On the very day that Edward IV returned to London in triumph, the old, deposed king, Henry VI, died in the Tower of London. The official story was that he died of pure displeasure and melancholy upon hearing of the battle and his son's death. But few believed it. It's almost certain that he was quietly murdered on Edward IV's orders. With Henry and his son both dead, there was no one left to rally the Lancastrian cause. The war, for now, was over. The Battle of Tewkesbury was more than just a Yorkist victory. It was the annihilation of a dynasty. It secured the throne for Edward IV and the House of York for over a decade, ushering in a period of relative peace and stability. It was the brutal and bloody climax of the Wars of the Roses, a day that saw a queen lose her kingdom, a prince lose his life, and a king lose his crown for the final time. The fields of Tewkesbury were not just the site of a battle. They were the graveyard of the House of Lancaster. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most dramatic moments. Let me know in the comments which battle you'd like to see covered next. Until then, stay curious.